What'd they do to him? Because there's a lot of speculation out there, but nobody. I mean, I've heard things, but what did they really do to him?
How does it feel wearing?
It's some good fabric, but it takes us back to the New Edition days.
Let's peel back the curtain on what Hollywood often sells as a golden opportunity: mentorship programs. On the surface, these initiatives seem like the ultimate gift to young rising stars, an exclusive backstage pass to the glitz and glamour of the industry, guided by its most powerful players. But when you start digging, you'll find whispers and shadows that suggest these programs are far from what they appear to be. And at the center of it all, towering names like Sean Diddy, Combs, and Will Smith, men who built their empires not just on talent, but on influence. Their alleged involvement in the mentorship of young stars like Brashear Gray paints a picture that's anything but inspiring.
Look at Diddy, for instance. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at him. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at, he has videos. He has videos of the parties. Now, what I've heard, which I don't know how much of it is in mainstream media, I don't really follow the story that much, but what I've heard from friends that are attorneys, friends of mine that have represented me before, agents and so on, is there's a bidding war going on.
Brashear Gray, known for his breakout role on Empire, was the kind of talent Hollywood loves to showcase. A young, charismatic performer with a magnetic presence. But what should have been his springboard to superstardom instead seems to have been the beginning of his unraveling. His introduction to Diddy and Will under the guise of a mentorship program was supposed to elevate him. Instead, according to explosive claims from industry whistleblower Jaguar Wright, it became a nightmare. Wright has been relentless in her mission to expose what she describes as a predatory system hiding in plain sight, and her focus on Diddy's alleged actions has sent shockwaves through the industry. What's particularly chilling is how these mentorship programs operated. Brashear was just 17 when he was connected to Diddy and Will, entrusted to their care by his then manager Charlie Mack. On paper, Mack's aim was to align Brashear with two titans of the industry, Diddy to hone his music career and Will to guide his acting. But according to Wright, what unfolded was not education, not opportunity, but something far darker. She claims that instead of mentorship, Brashear was subjected to an environment filled with manipulation and exploitation, leaving him a shell of the promising young man he once was.
The both worlds. Nobody talks about that.
Nobody talks about this shit.
Nobody talks about that project.
That's smooth under the rug.
Why?
Jaguar Wright has become the loudest voice in this scandal, unafraid to name names and detail what she says really happened. She alleges that Brashear's time with Diddy and Will was marked by degrading experiences that no young person should endure. And she isn't just relying on accusations. Wright has hinted at the existence of tapes, recordings that could blow the lid off this entire story. One such tape allegedly shows a gathering that involved not just Diddy and Will, but other prominent figures in the industry, with Brashear caught in the middle. These claims are staggering, and Wright's insistence on making them public has shaken Hollywood to its core. There's one thing Wright is making clear: it's that this isn't just about Diddy or Will, it's about a system that allowed this to happen. And when you look closer, the web of complicity becomes almost impossible to ignore. Start with Charlie Mack, the man who introduced Brashear to these so-called mentors. Mack's role has been scrutinized after Wright alleged that he actively facilitated Brashear's involvement with Diddy and Will, knowing full well what might occur. According to Wright, Mack wasn't just an enabler, he was a gatekeeper, someone who smoothed the path for Hollywood's elite to gain access to vulnerable young talent.
Literally waking up to allegations is kind of crazy.
But perhaps the most shocking claims involve Brashear's own mother, Andrea Mayberry. Wright has accused Mayberry of being complicit in her son's ordeal, suggesting that she prioritized career opportunities and financial gain over her child's well-being. It's a devastating accusation, one that paints a picture of betrayal not just by strangers, but by family. Wright has gone as far as to say that Mayberry turned a blind eye to the warning signs, choosing instead to focus on the potential perks of her son's rising fame. Whether or not these claims hold water, they add another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. And then there's Brashear himself, a young man who seemed destined for greatness, but whose life has spiraled into chaos. His legal troubles, including multiple arrests for violent behavior, have dominated headlines in recent years, painting him as a volatile figure. But when you connect the dots, a different picture begins to emerge, one of a young man deeply scarred by his experiences. Wright has suggested that Brashear's descent into violence and instability is directly tied to what he endured during his so-called mentorship. She paints a picture of someone who was used and discarded by the very people who were supposed to guide and protect him.
I have a career, I'm an artist, I have a lot of things to lose.
Consider the infamous 2020 incident where Brashear barricaded himself in his home, refusing to come out for hours as the SWAT team surrounded the property. The situation was chaotic, but for those who've been following Wright's claims, it felt like the inevitable outcome of years of unaddressed trauma. Brashear's mugshot from that arrest is haunting, not just because of his disheveled appearance, but because of what it represents. Here was a young man who once stood on the cusp of superstardom, now looking like someone who had been through a war. And in many ways, he had. What makes this story even harder to stomach is the broader context. Wright has been vocal about the culture of silence that surrounds these kinds of allegations in Hollywood. She's accused the industry of turning a blind eye to the exploitation of young talent, prioritizing profits and power over accountability. According to her, Brashear's story is just the tip of the iceberg. She claims there are countless other young men who've been through similar experiences, their lives forever altered by the very people who were supposed to help them succeed.
Centerpiece of a lot of what happened during direct testimony were freak-offs. And what the prosecution tried to show was that he forced and/or coerced her into doing these freak-offs. And we've talked about this earlier this week, that at least my opinion is that in a lot of these, the prosecution just didn't close the loop. It was something she felt.
And yet, despite the mounting accusations and the growing public outcry, the wheels of justice turned slowly. Wright has called out the authorities for failing to act sooner, drawing parallels to the mishandling of other high-profile cases involving powerful figures in the industry. She's argued that if investigators had taken earlier claims seriously, much of this could have been prevented. Instead, it took years and the bravery of people like Wright for these stories to surface. And even now, there's a sense that the full truth may never come to light. But here's the thing. This isn't just about Brashear or even about Diddy and Will. It's about a system that allowed this to happen. A system that has consistently protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The more you dig, the more you realize that this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern. One that stretches across decades and involves some of the biggest names in the industry. And as more details emerge, it becomes increasingly clear that this story is far from over. In fact, it feels like we're only just beginning to scratch the surface.
I hate to say that. I hate to say that because I really like Justin Bieber. I feel bad for Justin Bieber. And this is when that happened.
And if Brashear's fall from grace wasn't enough to paint a damning picture of how deep these wounds cut, the whispers about others, big names, bigger scandals, start to sound more like screams. This isn't just one young man's story anymore. It's a tangled web of power, fame, and exploitation that stretches far beyond one actor's tragic life. The deeper you dig, the more you realize that Brashear's alleged ordeal was not unique. It was part of a pattern that has ensnared other rising stars and left them to fend for themselves against some of the most powerful forces in the industry. Take Justin Bieber, for instance. A household name, a global phenomenon, someone who by all appearances had everything going for him from the very start. But then you start connecting the dots, and suddenly, his meteoric rise doesn't look so clean. The rumors about his time under Diddy's wing have never fully gone away. From the moment he stepped into the spotlight as a teenager, Bieber's association with Diddy raised eyebrows. The lavish outings, the cryptic comments, the strange mix of mentorship and unspoken boundaries, it all seemed just a little too curated, a little too controlled. And now, with Jaguar Wright's claims resurfacing and tapes allegedly making their way into the hands of prosecutors, people are starting to wonder what really happened during those formative years.
Sure, yeah, Justin Bieber has been getting this out in different ways. You could see it in his music and just what he's been trying to say.
Wright herself has hinted at Bieber being part of the same hidden narrative that consumed Brashear. She's alleged that Diddy's so-called mentorship programs were nothing more than a front, designed to manipulate and trap young talent under the guise of opportunity. And while Bieber has never publicly addressed the darker undertones of his early career, his silence on the matter only fuels speculation. The resurfaced footage of a young Justin, wide-eyed and eager, sitting beside Diddy as cryptic jokes about their special time together are made on national television. It's haunting now in a way it wasn't back then. Because back then, people laughed it off. They didn't want to believe there could be something more sinister lurking behind the charm and the glitz. But Bieber's story wasn't just about cryptic comments and suspicious mentorship programs. It was also about the strange ways his behavior began to change during his early years in the spotlight. Insiders have long pointed to his sudden rebellious streak, his erratic public outbursts, and his highly publicized struggles with management as signs of deeper turmoil. Some have even suggested that these were cries for help, masked as teenage rebellion. And when you pair that with Wright's claims that powerful figures in the industry use humiliation and control as tools of domination, Bieber's rapid transformation starts to look less like coincidence and more like the scars of an unspoken battle.
We'll take Justin Bieber. A grown man take Justin Bieber when he was young to a vacation, a romantic vacation, showing pictures on it.
Adding fuel to the fire, there are now whispers that Bieber has privately distanced himself from certain key figures in his past, figures who once seemed inseparable from his rise to fame. While his public statements have remained carefully vague, those close to him have hinted that he's quietly cutting ties with individuals who no longer align with his values. Could this be about more than personal growth? Could it be an attempt to shed the shadows of his past? To break free from a system that he may have been trapped in without fully understanding it at the time? And then there's Usher. If Justin Bieber's story feels riddled with unanswered questions, Usher's is a thunderclap of allegations that refuse to be ignored. Usher's connection to Diddy goes back decades, and the stories that have trickled out over the years are enough to make anyone uneasy. Usher himself has spoken in vague terms about his time living with Diddy as a teenager, describing it as wild and something I didn't fully understand at the time. But what exactly was he witnessing? And why does it feel like he's been tiptoeing around the full truth ever since? Wright has pointed to Usher as yet another young man allegedly drawn into the same exploitative system, a system that preyed on vulnerability and ambition in equal measure.
Moved to New York City, and I lived with Sean Puffy Combs for a year.
That's the crazy thing.
The idea that these mentorship programs were anything but safe havens for young talent is bolstered by the sheer volume of whispers, anecdotes, and open secrets that have surrounded Diddy's career for years. Take the infamous freak-off parties, gatherings that were allegedly more about control and submission than celebration. Multiple sources have claimed that these events were designed to test boundaries, to see who could be trusted, to stay silent, and who might need to be dealt with. And while the details of what went on behind closed doors remain murky, the implications are clear. These weren't just parties, they were power plays.
They saw evidence in the case. They immediately honed in on racketeering and they started saying, why is this racketeering with one guy? And they're charging this one guy. They had a real problem with that. They did not have a problem with the Mann Act. They found him guilty on the Mann Act. And they hung 6 to 6 on racketeering.
And it's not just Wright making these claims. Others in the industry have started to speak up, albeit cautiously. Terrence Howard, for one, has made cryptic comments about losing one's man card in Hollywood, a euphemism that seems to point to the same kind of exploitation Wright has been describing. Howard's remarks about the lengths some go to for success and the spiritual toll it takes feel less like abstract musings and more like a veiled confession. And when you add his name to the growing list of those who've alluded to something darker at play, it becomes harder and harder to dismiss these allegations as mere rumors. But the most chilling aspect of all this, the network of complicity that seems to stretch across the industry. These aren't isolated incidents involving one or two bad actors. This is a system, a well-oiled machine designed to protect the powerful and silence the vulnerable. From managers like Charlie Mack, who allegedly facilitated access to young talent, to family members who turned a blind eye in exchange for financial gain. The web of enablers is as extensive as it is insidious. And the more you learn, the clearer it becomes that this isn't just about Diddy or Will Smith or even the victims themselves. It's about an entire industry that has allowed this behavior to thrive unchecked for years.
They took Justin Bieber and just them. Not only is it bad look, it's sad.
And let's not forget the tapes, those elusive, whispered about recordings that could potentially blow this entire story wide open. Wright has claimed to have seen them, and if what she says is true, they're damning. Tapes allegedly showing gatherings where boundaries were crossed, where young men were put in positions they never should have been in. If these tapes do exist, and if they make their way into the court system, it could be the beginning of the end for more than just Diddy. It could topple an entire house of cards, implicating some of the biggest names in Hollywood and forcing an industry-wide reckoning. But here's the thing about Hollywood. It's built on secrets, on carefully crafted images and tightly controlled narratives. For every story that comes to light, there are a dozen more that never will. And as this scandal continues to unfold, the question isn't just who will be held accountable, it's how far this goes. How many more names will be dragged into the spotlight? How many more victims will find the courage to come forward? And how long can an industry built on silence and complicity keep its foundations from crumbling?
You know, there's a short life in
Why do you think that is with the creative side?
Well, because losing out money, you got to take. You're going through so much to try and deal with life.
So, what do you think? Is this the beginning of Hollywood's long overdue reckoning, or just another scandal that will be swept under the rug? How deep does this go, and who else might be implicated before it's all said and done? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, stay tuned, because this story is far from over. See you in the next one.